Welcome to the VCE English and EAL textbook from Matilda. I'm super excited to be walking you through this book today, not just the key features of the actual book itself, but also the digital platform that has a whole other layer of strategies and resources and information for you to be able to use as well. So let's have a look at what this looks like. We wanted the students to be front and center through this book, and it feel like they've got an extra 3 teachers who have got their backs to walk them through this complicated year. So there's a layer of well-being, support and advice beyond simply the content and skills that students need to cope with along the way. The book is essentially broken into the 3 main sections of the study design. So reading and responding, unit 3 and 4 are in chapter 2. Creating text in chapter 3, and analysing argument in chapter 4. We wanted to put all the key information that you might need as a teacher in the one resource. So we have the big overview, and as this is English and EAL, as much as we can, we've put EAL and English side by side so you can see the differences and all the similarities along the way as well. One of the key things about this particular study design is that it is trying to ensure that students can transfer skills, not just from year 11 into year 12, but between units in year 12 as well. So I went through and I audited all the skills, and what I discovered was that there were these common skills in all 3 sections: reading skills and engaging in text, and constructing skills in all reading and responding, creating text, and argument analysis. And then there's these subtle differences of the types of text that we read and write for each of the sections. So we wanted to emphasize that for students and be able to link back to these common skills as we build and develop them throughout the course. What you'll notice up here is whenever you see one of these blue icons, if you click on them, it'll take you to a resource that you can download. So for example, this is activating prior knowledge. What I've done here is explain a bunch of prior knowledge activities that you can use to be able to support students through this course, because the whole idea is that students aren't coming in with nothing. They have gone through all these skills and knowledge before. And we want to build upon them, capitalize upon them, and be able to see students develop. And activating prior knowledge in different ways, in different capacities for students is vital. So I wanted to make sure that you had a bunch of different strategies that you could use along the way. Whenever there's an activity block and there is a table or a graph that students are to complete, then we have also included those for you to be able to download, print, and work with your students for. So let's go through the 3 main chapters and be able to consider how we can get the very most out of these. You can always just go over to the table of contents and then be able to come down to the reading and responding and go straight there. And then each of the steps we can link to along the way. Now, these steps are set out in our journey map at the start of each chapter. And this journey map essentially is a contents page, if you want to think of it like that. But its intention was to be able to represent the fact that students are going on this journey. You'll notice that it doesn't kind of start nowhere, they're coming with things, and that it continues on past this particular unit. We wanted students to recognize where they were up to in the unit and where they're going and how they are building their skills as they work their way through. It's emphasizing for students and for you as a teacher the importance of understanding that this is a journey, that we don't need to or want to know all the information right from the start, but that we are taking each step as we go and building upon it. And that's the idea of these journey maps, to be able to visually see where we're up to and what we've got left moving forward. The next thing each chapter has are the key knowledge and skills from the study design. Now, we have categorized them so that it's easier for us to kind of understand what the different sections are. But we wanted to put them forefront and center so that students recognize that it's not just the SAC that we're working towards, even though it feels like it sometimes, but the whole unit is about these particular skills and knowledge that we're trying to develop. And it's those skills and knowledge that then build towards the exam as well. By putting them here, we're hoping that you and your students can engage in them and consider what this unit actually means beyond simply the essay at the end. Because Unit 3 and 4 are combined into one chapter, students can focus on Unit 3 in their first reading of the chapter, but visually see that Unit 4 is happening and that it's something that it is worth investing in because they're going to come back to it in Unit 4. It means also when they come back to it in Unit 4 that then they're going to literally see the Unit 3 activity, remember themselves doing it, activate that prior knowledge, and connect it then to their new set text in Unit 4. The next thing that all of the chapters have are the performance descriptors from the VCAR website. Now, although schools don't have to use this, we wanted to be able to include them to start the conversation, to recognise before we even get into this unit what we're working ourselves towards, and to connect back to where students have been for their Year 11 SAC and where they're moving through for all the information that's coming from here. We've also got the English and the EAL that we reflect on at the end. One of the problems we found with traditional textbooks for reading and responding units is the fact that everyone's doing different set texts. And by giving a small excerpt for different texts along the way to be able to use as worked examples might have been good if you happen to have one or two from your set text. But for all the others, students had no context around that particular text. And what that meant is that it's very hard for them to be able to work out what that worked example is really showing and the subtleties of it. So to overcome that, rather than give any examples from a particular set text, we've used this flash fiction by Chloe Wilson called The Leopard Next Door. That's literally how long it is. And the idea is that students can read very quickly that text, and all the worked examples through this unit are about that text, meaning that students can see me work my way through pulling this text apart, understanding the plot and the characters, the setting and the context, the construction, and being able to take all those pieces and be able to build an essay with it. One of the features of the digital platform is, if you come up here,
Leopard Next Door. My neighbour bought a leopard. He bought it when it was 8 days old.
You can listen to the text, and it is actually Chloe Wilson who has done the recording for us for The Leopard Next Door. But we are currently in the process of getting a voice artist to go through and read the text completely so that students can listen to audio throughout. So for this particular chapter, students work through the plot and narrative features, the characters, the construction, setting and historical context, and then ideas, concerns, and conflicts. Along the way, all the worked examples are about The Leopard Next Door. And then any time that the students get to an activity block that has a table in it or something they're asked to do, they can download an editable version. Now, this means a couple of things. One, you can obviously print it off, or students can digitally download it, but it also means you can come in and you can add particular questions that you want to use for your students, particular ideas, or for example, you could write the character names in of what you wanted the students to analyze, or change the amount of lines there are or how big they are. So they're all set up for you to be able to use as is, or to be able to change depending on how you need them to work for your particular set text. What you'll notice about the activity blocks is that they have subheadings, and these subheadings relate back to the particular subheadings of the unit, which means that when students come to Unit 4, they can then go, oh, character mapping, and then they can go back to the subheading called character mapping to remind themselves what they went through last time. And then be able to complete the activities from there. Now, the EAL comprehension task sits within step 7, understanding, setting, historical context and social and cultural values of your set text, because that's what the comprehension task is supposed to be focused on, context. However, we wanted to make sure that though EAL students were supported for their SAC itself, we also wanted to be able to emphasise that this particular task is really useful for English students as well, because one, comprehending listening text is part of their key knowledge and skills for English and EAL. And two, by doing the listening comprehension task with English students, it sets them up to help them in Unit 4 when they get to argument analysis, when they have to do the audio-visual analysis as well. But we do prepare students for the EAL SAC, and we give them an example of a note form summary for the leopard next door, and a worked example of different questions and answers for a comprehension short answer response. We have a number of worked examples through this chapter. We give a bunch of strategies for students who are struggling in different elements of this outcome, and then ultimately give a worked example of a plan as well as a final SAC for the leopard next door. The last thing we do for each of the 3 chapters is ask students to reflect and plan for how they're going to build upon the skills they've done for this particular outcome. And then we connect the unit to the exam before we even start the next unit. We want students to recognize that although they might have finished their SAC, the unit is not over, and that we're going to take this information, hold on to it as we move through. So creating text works in a similar way. We have a journey map, we have key knowledge and skills, we have the SAC criteria for English and for EAL. And then for the frameworks, we begin with a mood board for each of the framework of ideas. We wanted to be able to stimulate conversation and inspiration and motivation right from the start. And obviously you can use any of these visuals or quotes as part of writing stimulus and things like that. We have chosen one small excerpt from each of the mentor text as a worked example to be able to kind of start considering those. But we're just finalising a comprehensive teaching document that is a full summary of each of the mentor texts. It goes through a summary of what it's about, the context, audience, and purpose, and then the key structural and language features for all. So all the key information you'd need for all of the mentor texts, and that'll be in the digital resources. In the textbook, we just have the small worked example and a bunch of questions and ways to explore that particular idea. So we have one for each of the frameworks. The main focus, however, of this chapter is, rather than the framework and the mentor text, is focusing on writing, because this is a writing unit. So we set up the idea of the key features that students need to be able to grapple with and understand and be able to see in the mentor text, and then focus on how we can apply them into our own writing. So we focus very much on audience, purpose, and context, before then focusing on the 4 elements that the study design have articulated: authentic voice, rich language and vocabulary, innovative text structures, and interesting language features. And we work through those 4 sections, looking at different examples, ways of playing with it, how to build and understand these different kinds of concepts, how we can see it in other texts, and how we can use it to experiment in our own. Ultimately, we work all the way through the writing process and bring all the pieces together so that we can spend the time understanding and applying that into our own writing. We wanted to give a bunch of different advice and features around drafting and editing, and consider the key elements for the commentary by giving a short example of a written text, and then an example not only of the commentary, but what an EAL annotation might look like as well. So both the commentary and the annotation is based on the same text, so students can see the similarities and differences of how that might be built. Regarding the examples for the SAC for creating text, what we've done is create one sample piece, a writing piece, and a commentary for each of the frameworks. However, those 4 pieces are different text types with different purposes and audiences. So that even though you might be looking at personal journeys as your framework, and we have a expressive, reflective type of text, that it would be just as useful for you to be able to look at the country example and look at this informative article and the language and features that are being used. We have an incident report as a sample text. where a student has gotten into trouble and has had to write a reflective piece on what they did and why they did it and what they've learned from the process. Or an open letter to the bosses of a student's parents. What we're trying to do is show really vastly different types of texts with different contexts and purposes. We wanted to have some that very much connected with mentor text, such as the play, which very much connected with the open letter to Doubting Thomas mentor text, and others that may have used a word or two or an inspiration idea of a mentor text, but wrote something drastically different. Finally, with analysing argument, again, we have the journey map, we have the key knowledge and skills, we have the performance descriptors for English and for EAL, and for task 1 and for task 2. But what we've done with this particular unit is, just like you have to do at your school, choose an issue to focus on. So our issue is climate change, and all the texts and worked examples are around climate change. So then we set up a bunch of different worked examples of different text types. Initially written texts and visual texts and audio-visual texts. And there are links to all of these worked examples throughout. Once we've set that up, then we get step 6. And step 6 is the main step for this particular chapter. It works through 8 elements that we need to be able to analyze a persuasive text. What we're then able to do is use all the text that we've used as worked examples up until this point, and we're able to then connect them to the rhetorical triangle and the devices within that. So we've categorized all of the persuasive features into the 3 elements of the rhetorical triangle. And in each of them, we obviously have a definition, an explanation, and the example comes from a text that we have previously looked at. So students then can see the example, but go back to the text itself and be able to see it in context. The sample analysis then works through different ways that we can use that language, so that students notice that we're not always starting in the same way or structuring things in the same way, that we can change anaphora to anaphoric, depending on how we use it within the sentence. One of the great features of this particular platform is your ability to be able to add notes, documents, and features to the resource that you can then share with your students. So if you double click on any word that you like, you can add a note to be able to describe what's going on or remember the connection with this or anything that you like. You might highlight particular sections so that they can sort of see what's important, or students can highlight along the way. You can connect either a web link or hyperlink to a particular document. So for example, particularly for argument analysis, you might link in particular texts, audiovisual texts that are about your issue, so that students, when they're looking at particular ideas, connect it to their issue directly. So anything that you include in here, you can push to your students. It can be a document, it can be a web link, so that students then can be able to connect the pieces directly in the same space from what is happening in the textbook, and you can contextualize it in the context of your school, your issue, your text, whatever it is that you're focusing on. You can also include a voice memo if you want to be able to explain something in more detail and be able to remind students of particular concepts. I find this feature particularly useful if you're going to use this text as a flipped learning type of resource, where you ask students to look through a particular section, a step, or a section of a step before they come to class. And so you might be able to highlight certain things, attach particular documents, or send a short voice message to be able to explain the concept and how it goes. It also would work very well if you have to leave a certain section as a cover, where you can quickly record yourself explaining what you want students to do and what it looks like and how you want them to engage within the text while you're not there. The SAC example has an annotated written text and a link to the audiovisual text that's used. And then rather than just the sample SAC, I've also included the sample planning for it, for the written text and for the audiovisual text, with all the key elements that we've worked through this particular chapter with, so they can see what we're identifying and then be able to connect those pieces to where it sits and how it's used within the sample SAC. The spoken SAC doesn't have to be a classic speech. So we discuss that idea of discussions, debates, and dialogues, and look at different types of, yes, speeches, but also other types of spoken text that students may or may not end up engaging with. It means that this particular section is a little broader than you might have generally seen for this particular outcome, because this particular task is broader. We do give a worked example of a slightly more traditional speech in the sense of a TED Talk. But the reason we've done that is that then you can go and watch the speech, so you can see not only just the words that have been written, but the way that it's presented and the paralinguistic features that are used, as well as the actual words themselves. The final section is the exam, and we do focus, rather than the content, on the way that students can study for this particular outcome. We know that many students struggle to work out how to study for English. So we've included some sample study timetable documents that students can edit and write in for themselves, either specifically for English or overall. Now, obviously, you can change these up as much as you like, make it work for particular students, but we wanted to be able to give you as much as we possibly could around ways of approaching this idea. Now, although we have some suggested study activities for 15 minutes, 30 minutes, or 60 minutes, most of the resources for this particular section are going to be digital resources as soon as we know what the exam looks like. Initially, we were going to include much more information, particularly around section A and section C, but we didn't want to assume anything about this exam. And the last thing we would want to do is put something that was even remotely inaccurate within the text. So we stripped this section right back to the bare essentials of the key features around how we deal with an exam generally. And then we are going to add in layers upon layers of support for students and you to be able to use once we fully know what the exam's about. And the bonus is that we can add all these different things that potentially we might not have been able to fit into the book otherwise. So that's essentially the book. You can obviously change the view to a single page or a double page, and you can go directly to a particular page by typing in the top. Down on the left-hand side, you've got annotations that you've included. So you can come here if you've added any, or bookmarks. So along the way, if we click this little box, it'll come up with a bookmark so we can come easily back to it if there are particular pages that we want to kind of focus on for the students or for ourselves to be able to look at particular things. All the extra resources outside of the textbook itself sit in here, and they are categorized into the different chapters. So rather than find the page that they're on, if you know, for example, that you're looking for some sample questions, then you can go directly to preparing for the SAC, and we can find the sample topic questions. We've got 2 questions for each of the 20 texts within that particular section. So you can go over here if you know what the resource you're looking for, then you can go down and find whichever resource that your heart's desire. We're going to continue to add different resources to the document as time goes on, the more we understand about this particular study design and the kinds of things that you need as a teacher. So if you have questions along the way, or you're really hoping that there is another element that you might be able to use, then please reach out and ask us, and we will see what we're able to do. Ultimately, our goal is for you to reach your potential as a teacher and for your students to be able to make the very most of this year. We wanted to create a textbook that wasn't something supplementary that you had to kind of fit in, but that fit naturally into your teaching, that complements the way that you teach and the way that you want to teach and the way that students learn. And that is ultimately our goal for this particular textbook. So we're super excited to see it in classrooms for 2024, and we look forward to hearing how successful you have managed to make it. Good luck.